The grand concert hall in Vienna was packed tight that night. It was one of those chilly winter evenings where the warmth inside the building felt like a special luxury. Outside, the wind was howling, but inside, the air was thick with expensive perfume and the low hum of wealthy people talking. Everyone was dressed in their finest clothes. The men wore dark suits and bow ties, and the women sparkled in jewelry that cost more than most people earn in a year. They were there to see Julian Thorne, the most famous pianist in the world. He was known as a genius, but also a bit cold. People said he didn't like ordinary folks much, but when his fingers touched the piano keys, nobody cared about his personality. They just wanted to hear the magic. The lights in the hall dimmed until the room was almost dark, except for a single bright spotlight shining on the stage. The crowd went silent immediately. Thousands of people held their breath. Julian walked onto the stage. He looked sharp in his black tuxedo. He sat down on the bench, straightened his jacket, and paused for a moment. Then, he began to play. The music was intense. It was loud and fast, and incredibly difficult. Julian's hands moved across the keys like they were made of water. The sound filled every corner of the huge hall. For the next hour, nobody coughed, nobody whispered, and nobody checked their phones. They were completely captured. When he hit the final note, a heavy, deep sound that seemed to hang in the air. He pulled his hands back and stood up. The applause was instant. It wasn't just clapping. It was a roar. People stood to their feet. They cheered and shouted bravo. Julian bowed once, then twice. He looked calm, almost bored, as if he knew he was the best in the room and didn't need to prove anything. The clapping went on for a long time. Usually the pianist would walk off the stage and leave the audience wanting more, but tonight Julian didn't leave. He walked to the front of the stage, right to the edge of the lights, looked out at the crowd. He wasn't looking at the front row where the rich donors sat. He was squinting, looking past them into the darker part of the hall. The standing section in the back was where people went when they couldn't afford the expensive seats. It was crowded and a bit cramped. That's where she was standing. Martha was an elderly woman who looked like she had seen a lot of hard days in her life. She was wearing a thick wool coat that looked like it was bought 20 years ago. It wasn't faded on purpose like the fancy clothes. It was faded because she had worn it through many winters to keep warm. Under the coat, she had a simple dress, and on her feet were sensible, flat shoes that were clean but well worn. Her hair was white and pulled back in a messy bun. She held an old leather tote bag tight against her chest with both hands, as if she was protecting something very precious inside it. She had come to the concert because she loved music. Plain and simple. She had saved up for months to buy the cheapest ticket just to be in the same room as the piano. She was standing near the back, squeezed between a tall young man and a woman, wearing too much perfume. Martha didn't mind. She just closed her eyes and let the music wash over her. While the rich people in the front analyzed the technique, Martha just felt the emotion. She was smiling to herself, remembering her own past. Suddenly, the chatter in the room changed. People started pointing and murmuring. Julian Thorne was pointing a finger right at the back of the room. He motioned with his hand for someone to come forward. At first, the people around Martha didn't notice. They looked at the VIPs nearby, wondering who Julian was calling. But then, Julian walked down the steps from the stage and started walking up the main aisle, still pointing. He stopped a few rows away and looked directly at Martha. "You," he said. His voice was quiet, but the microphone near the piano picked it up. "The lady in the coat." "Please come here." Martha froze. Her eyes went wide. She looked to her left, then to her right, hoping he meant someone else. But the tall young man next to her nudged her arm. "I think he means you, lady," he whispered. Martha shook her head nervously. "Oh no," she mumbled. "Not me." Julian didn't give up. He smiled, a rare sight for him, and walked closer. "Please," he insisted. "I need you on the stage." Now everyone in the hall was looking at her. Thousands of eyes turned to the back. As the spotlight swung around to find her, the crowd saw who she was. They saw her old coat and her tired face. They saw the tote bag. A ripple of laughter went through the expensive seats. It wasn't a nice laughter. It was the laugh of people who thought they were witnessing a joke. People whispered to each other. "Who is that?" someone asked. "Is that a cleaner?" A woman in the front row giggled. "Did he lose a bet?" The laughter grew louder as Martha hesitated. Her face turned bright red with embarrassment. She felt small and insignificant. She just wanted to disappear into the floor. But Julian was standing there, waiting. He wasn't laughing. He looked serious. Finally, with shaking legs, Martha stepped out of the crowd. She began the long walk down the aisle toward the stage. The laughter swelled like a wave. It was cruel. The rich audience thought this was part of the show. They thought Julian was going to make fun of this poor old woman. They expected him to ask her a silly question or maybe just have her stand there like a prop while he made a witty remark. It felt like a game to them, a game where Martha was the punchline. She walked with her head down, clutching her bag, wishing she had never bought a ticket. As she reached the orchestra pit, Julian offered her his hand to help her up the stairs. He was gentle, but the crowd just laughed harder. "Look at that," a man shouted. "A duet." Martha stepped onto the wooden stage. The floor was shiny and slippery. She felt dizzy under the bright lights. She could barely see the audience, but she could hear them. They were restless, amused, and waiting for the joke to land. Julian led her to the center of the stage, right in front of the massive black Steinway piano. It looked like a shiny beast next to her small figure. Julian stood by the microphone. The laughter started to die down as people waited for him to speak. He looked at Martha, then he looked out at the crowd. He didn't say anything funny. He didn't introduce her as a comedian. He just stood there, calm and composed, while Martha stood next to him, looking terrified and out of place. The atmosphere in the hall was strange. It was a mix of high society arrogance and confusion. They were ready to be entertained by what they thought was a prank, unaware that their own judgment was about to be challenged in a way they never expected. Martha stood on the stage, her legs trembling so badly she was afraid her knees might knock together. The bright spotlight made it impossible to see anything beyond the edge of the stage, but she could feel the eyes of thousands of people burning into her. She could hear the murmuring and the occasional burst of laughter from the dark pit where the audience sat. It wasn't the sound of respect. It was the sound of amusement. They thought she was a clown. They thought this was a comedy skit. She was the punchline. She clutched her old canvas tote bag tighter against her chest. It was her only shield. Inside, she had a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, a bottle of water, and a small worn-out Bible. She felt the urge to turn around and run back down the stairs, out of the grand hall and into the cold night air. But Julian was standing right there. He looked calm, his hands clasped behind his back, watching her with a patient expression that made no sense to her. Why had he pulled her up here? What was he trying to prove? Julian walked over to the piano bench. He pulled it out slightly and dusted it off with his handkerchief, even though it was already perfectly clean. Then he gestured for Martha to sit. The crowd went quiet for a split second, and then a new wave of whispers rippled through the room. They couldn't believe he was actually letting her touch the instrument. To them, the piano was a holy relic, a machine worth millions of dollars. And this woman in the faded coat looked like she didn't belong in the same building, let alone on the bench. Martha shook her head frantically. "Oh no," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I can't. I really can't." She took a step back, nearly tripping on the hem of her long coat. Julian leaned in close to her. "It's all right," he said softly. The microphone didn't pick this up, so it was a private moment between the two of them. "Please, just sit for a moment." He didn't force her, but his eyes were kind. They weren't the cold, judging eyes of the audience. Martha looked at those eyes and took a deep, shaky breath. She decided to trust him. She walked over to the bench and sat down. It was uncomfortable and slippery. She perched on the edge, afraid to lean back against the velvet. She placed her tote bag on the floor beside her feet, feeling exposed without it. The piano was huge in front of her. It gleamed black under the lights. The keys were white and perfect, staring back at her like rows of teeth. Martha's heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She placed her hands in her lap, hiding her fingers. She knew what her hands looked like. They were the hands of a worker. The skin was rough and red from years of washing dishes in cold water and scrubbing floors. Her knuckles were swollen and stiff with arthritis. They were ugly hands compared to Julian's smooth, elegant fingers. She didn't want anyone to see them. From the darkness of the auditorium, someone shouted, "Play chopsticks." A few people snickered loudly. Another voice yelled, "Maybe she's the tuner." The laughter erupted again, louder this time. It was mean and ignorant. It bounced off the high ceilings and echoed in Martha's ears. She felt her face burn hot with shame. She wanted to cry, but she bit her lip to stop the tears. She stared down at her lap, wishing she could vanish. Julian turned to face the audience. The laughter quieted down as they waited for him to speak. He walked to the microphone stand and tapped it lightly. "We have a very special guest tonight," he said. His voice was smooth and clear. The crowd waited for the joke. They expected him to introduce her as a comedian or a friend from his hometown to set up the prank. "She is a listener," Julian continued. "A true listener." He paused. "I want her to play." This announcement shocked the room into a confused silence. It wasn't a joke. He was serious. The realization made the crowd uncomfortable. They looked at each other, confused by the lack of a punchline. Why would a world-class pianist let a random elderly woman play his expensive instrument? Was he mocking the audience? Was he mocking her? The air in the hall grew tense. The arrogance from earlier turned into a harsh, waiting skepticism. Julian walked back over to Martha. He didn't stand behind her like a teacher ready to correct her. He stood to the side, leaning against the piano, giving her space. He looked down at her and smiled gently. "Whatever's in your heart," he whispered. "Just play that." Martha looked at the keys. They were terrifying. She hadn't played a real piano in decades. There was an old out-of-tune upright in the basement of the community center where she sometimes worked. But she only played that when no one else was around. She would sneak in during her lunch break and play soft, simple melodies to calm herself before going back to work. But this was a monster of a piano. She hesitated. The silence in the hall was heavy. It pressed against her ears. She could feel the impatience radiating from the front rows. They were waiting for her to fail. They were waiting for her to hit a wrong note to prove that she didn't belong, so they could laugh and go back to their comfortable lives. Martha took her hands out of her lap. She held them hovering over the keys for a moment. They looked so small and so damaged above the pristine ivories. Her fingers were crooked and stiff. She felt a sharp pain in her joints, a reminder of her age. She closed her eyes for a second and blocked out the faces she couldn't see. She stopped thinking about the expensive clothes and the judgment. She thought about the music. She thought about how the sound of a piano had always been her best friend. Her escape when life got too hard. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly. She didn't know what she was going to play. She didn't have a sheet music. She just knew she had to make a sound. She had to break the terrible silence that was laughing at her. Her trembling right hand moved toward the keys. The audience leaned forward collectively. They were holding their breath, ready to snicker at the first clumsy mistake. Martha's index finger touched a key. It was just one note, a soft, tentative sound, like a question asked in the dark. But she didn't pull away. She let the note hang in the air. And then something shifted in her mind. The fear began to recede, pushed back by a sudden, fierce determination. She realized that this might be the only chance in her entire life to touch an instrument like this. She wasn't going to just tap one key and run away. She shifted her body on the bench, getting a better angle. She placed both hands on the keyboard now. The audience couldn't see it, but her expression changed. The look of terror on her face hardened into focus. She wasn't the shy cleaning lady anymore. She was about to show them something they never expected. For a few long seconds, nothing happened. The only sound in the giant hall was the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant traffic noise from the street outside. Martha sat on the bench, her back slightly hunched, staring at the black and white keys as if they were a puzzle she couldn't solve. The audience grew restless. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was awkward. People started shifting in their seats. A few men coughed loudly into their fists. Someone near the front whispered loudly, "I knew this was a waste of time." The cruelty was starting to creep back in. They were getting bored, and when rich people get bored, they get mean. Martha's hands hovered over the keys. They looked painful to see. Her knuckles were large and swollen, thickened by years of hard work and age. The skin was rough, spotted with age, and looked dry. Her fingers were not long and slender like the pianists they were used to seeing. They were short and stubby. To the critics in the crowd, she looked like a butcher or a baker who had lost her way and sat at the wrong instrument. They couldn't see the music in her. They only saw the arthritis. They saw a body that was breaking down. She pressed down a single key with her right thumb. It was a soft, hollow note plink. It sounded like a drop of water falling in a tin bucket. A ripple of giggles moved through the back rows. Julian stood perfectly still beside the piano. He didn't flinch. He didn't look embarrassed. He just watched Martha's hands with a look of intense curiosity. He leaned in slightly, as if he was listening to a secret being told. Martha didn't pull her hands away. Instead, she took a deep breath that filled her lungs and expanded her chest. It was a shaky breath, the kind you take before you jump into cold water. She closed her eyes tight for a moment, shutting out the blinding lights and the judgment of thousands of strangers. In that darkness behind her eyelids, she wasn't in a concert hall in Vienna. She was back in her small, drafty living room 40 years ago. She was young, strong, and full of dreams. She could remember the feeling of the old piano her parents had bought used. The one with a sticky pedal. Suddenly her posture changed. It wasn't a big movement, but the people in the front row noticed it. She stopped slouching. Her spine straightened. She leaned into the instrument, bringing her face closer to the keys. The fear on her face seemed to melt away, replaced by a look of pure concentration. Her hands, which had been hovering timidly, suddenly dropped. They didn't hit the keys. They settled onto them with a familiarity that was shocking. She began to play. It wasn't chopsticks. It wasn't a simple nursery rhyme. She struck a chord, 3 notes played at once. It was a G minor chord, deep and resonant. The sound filled the hall instantly. It was rich and dark, vibrating through the floorboards and up the legs of the seats. The giggling in the crowd stopped abruptly. The chord hung in the air, heavy and serious. Then, her right hand began to move. Martha's fingers, stiff and swollen as they were, moved with a speed that seemed impossible. It wasn't the flashy, blurring speed of a conservatory student showing off. It was a controlled, determined speed. She played a run of notes that cascaded down the keyboard like rain rolling off a roof. Dot, 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 dot. The melody was familiar to those who knew classical music. But she was playing it with a strange, intense power. The transformation in her was undeniable. The old woman in the faded coat was gone. In her place was a musician. Her face, which had been twisted with anxiety a moment ago, was now calm. Her eyes were closed, her head tilted slightly to the side, listening intently to the sound she was creating. Her left hand was keeping a steady driving rhythm on the lower notes, while her right hand danced over the higher keys. Julian watched closely. He saw something the audience couldn't see from a distance. He saw that despite the deformity in her joints, she knew exactly how to use her weight. She wasn't using just her finger muscles. She was using the weight of her entire arms to press the keys down. She was playing with her whole soul. The arthritis in her hand seemed to vanish as the adrenaline took over. The pain was pushed aside by the music. The audience sat in stunned silence. The man who had shouted chopsticks earlier was now sitting with his mouth slightly open. The woman in the front row forgot about her diamond necklace. The sneers were wiped away, replaced by confusion. They were trying to process what was happening. They had expected a joke. They had expected a disaster. Instead, they were hearing something beautiful, something real, something that didn't care about their money or their status. Martha's playing wasn't technically perfect. There were tiny imperfections, a split second of hesitation here, a slightly blurred note there, but it didn't matter. The emotion behind the notes was so strong that it carried the music past any mistakes. She played with a rubato, a stolen time. She slowed down at the sad parts and sped up at the exciting parts, bending the rhythm to fit her feelings. It was the kind of playing that cannot be taught in a school. It comes from living a hard life and surviving it. She was playing a piece that told a story of longing. The music swelled, getting louder and more intense. Martha's body swayed with the music. Her foot found the sustained pedal, and she pressed it down, letting the notes blend together into a wash of sound. The grand piano, an instrument that required the utmost respect, was singing for her. It was responding to her touch, just as it had responded to Julian's, but in a completely different voice. Julian's playing was sharp and cold like ice. Martha's playing was warm and earthy like soil. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look for approval. She was lost in the world of the melody. In her mind, she was playing for her late husband, who had never had the chance to hear her perform on a stage like this. She was playing for the children she had raised alone, scrubbing floors to pay for their food. She was playing for every dream she had packed away in a box in the closet decades ago. And now, those dreams were pouring out of her fingers, filling the golden hall with a sound that was too powerful to ignore. The silence in the room deepened. It was a heavy, shocked silence. No one breathed. The only movement was the dust motes dancing in the spotlight and Martha's hands flying across the keys. The cruelty of the earlier laughter had been completely silenced, beaten down by the sheer force of her talent. The rich and the poor, the young and the old, were all captivated by the ordinary woman who turned out to be extraordinary. The first few minutes had shattered their assumptions completely. But she was just getting started. She was about to show them that music doesn't belong to the elite, belongs to anyone brave enough to play it. The melody that flowed from the instrument was not just a song. It was a story being told without words. As Martha's hands moved across the keys, the heavy atmosphere in the concert hall began to shift. The people in the expensive seats, who had been ready to laugh only a few minutes ago, were now frozen in their chairs. The air in the room felt different. The arrogance and the judgment seemed to evaporate, replaced by a thick, heavy silence that only true art can create. Martha was playing a piece by Franz's Liszt, a composition known for its beauty and its difficulty. It was Liebestrom, which means dream of love. Most professional pianists played it with technical perfection, focusing on hitting every note exactly as written. But Martha didn't play it like a machine. She played it like a human being who had loved and lost. She took her time with the music. She let some notes linger in the air, hanging there like memories. Before she moved on to the next one, the sound coming from the piano was incredibly warm. It wasn't the sharp, brittle sound that often filled the hall. It was a deep, rich tone that seemed to wrap around the audience. Even the people who knew nothing about music could feel the difference. It sounded like the piano was sighing. The way she pressed the keys, using the weight of her shoulders rather than just the strength of her fingers, made the instrument sing in a way that shocked everyone listening. It was a sound full of soul, full of a lifetime of feelings. Martha's face was completely transformed. The fear was gone. The wrinkles on her forehead smoothed out as her eyes closed tight. She wasn't an old woman in a faded coat anymore. She was a young girl again, dancing in a kitchen. She was a mother, humming a lullaby. She was a woman remembering a love she had lost decades ago. A small tear escaped from the corner of her eye and rolled down her cheek, catching the light, but she didn't wipe it away. She was too busy living inside the music. She had forgotten where she was. She had forgotten the thousands of people staring at her. There was only the sound and the feeling of the ivory keys. Beneath her fingers, the physical sight of her hands was mesmerizing. Up close, one could see the deformities of her arthritis. Her knuckles were large and knotted, and her fingers were stiff. It should have been impossible for her to play such complex music. But her hands moved with a will of their own. It looked like the music was pouring out of her, pushing through the pain and the stiffness. When her right hand had to move quickly up the high end of the keyboard, her fingers stumbled slightly. It wasn't perfect. But she didn't stop. She didn't panic. She just kept going, smoothing over the tiny mistake with so much emotion that no one cared. In fact, the slight imperfection made the performance even more real. It proved that she wasn't a robot. She was a person giving everything she had. Julian stood a few feet away, watching her with a look of pure awe. He had played this piece thousands of times in his career. He knew every note, every dynamic mark, every pedal change. But listening to Martha, He realized he had never truly understood the song before. He played it with his brain, but she was playing it with her heart. He crossed his arms, a slow smile spreading across his face. He felt a sense of gratitude that he had invited her up. He wasn't the star of the show anymore. He was just a lucky witness to a miracle. Out in the audience, a young man in the front row put his phone away. He had been recording a video to make fun of the performance for his friends, but now his hand hung down by his side. He forgot to post anything. He just stared, his mouth slightly open. The woman who had sneered at Martha's coat earlier now had tears in her own eyes. She looked down at her expensive dress and suddenly felt silly. She realized that the woman on stage, with her old clothes and her swollen hands, possessed something that money could not buy. The pretense of the evening had shattered. There were no rich people and poor people in the room at that moment. There were just human beings listening to a universal language. The music grew louder and more intense. Martha's left hand was keeping a steady heartbeat rhythm, while her right hand flew up and down the keys in cascading waves of sound. The music swelled until it felt like the entire hall was vibrating. The chandeliers overhead seemed to shimmer in sympathy with the music. It was a sound of longing, of deep sadness, but also of incredible hope. It was the sound of a life fully lived, with all its pain and joy mixed together. People began to lean forward in their seats. They didn't want to miss a single note. The silence was absolute now. No one coughed, no one whispered, no one moved. It was as if the entire crowd was holding its breath collectively. They were afraid that if they made a sound, the spell would be broken. They were witnessing something that defied logic. A woman they had dismissed as a nobody was captivating them completely. The joke was on them, but they didn't feel angry about it. They felt humbled. They were realizing that true talent doesn't care about appearances. It doesn't care about expensive suits or VIP passes. It lives in the heart, and sometimes it hides in the most unexpected places. Martha was nearing the end of the piece. The music was rising to a climax. Her movements became more pronounced, her body swaying with the rhythm. She was pouring her entire life force into the instrument. Every tough shift she had ever worked, every cold night she had ever endured, every sacrifice she had ever made, it was all flowing out through her fingertips. The piano roared under her hands. It was a triumphant sound, a declaration of existence. She was telling the world, I am here and I matter. The intensity kept building higher and higher, wrapping around the audience like a tightrope. Everyone in the hall could feel the tension rising, waiting for that final moment of release. Martha's face was lifted toward the ceiling, her expression one of pure ecstasy. She was no longer the shy woman from the back of the room. She was a queen on her throne. The final note was approaching, a high, delicate note that would resolve the song and bring it back to rest. The crowd leaned in, thousands of hearts beating in time with the rhythm of her performance. The air was electric, charged with an energy that no one had expected when the night began. They were all on the edge of their seats, desperate to see how it would end, knowing that they would never forget this moment for as long as they lived. The final high note hung in the air of the concert hall, shimmering like a star. It didn't fade away quickly. It seemed to suspend time itself. Martha's hands lifted from the keys, her fingers trembling slightly from the exertion, her shoulders dropping as the energy left her body. She sat there on the bench, staring at the polished black wood of the piano, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She was back in the real world now. The music had stopped, but the feeling it left behind was heavy and electric. For the first few seconds, the hall was completely silent. It wasn't the polite silence of waiting for the song to be over. It was a shocked, breathless silence. The kind of silence where thousands of people realize they have just witnessed something they can't explain.
Oh.
The air in the room felt different. It felt cleansed. The arrogance, the judgment, the cruel laughter from earlier writ had all been blown away by the storm of her performance. No one moved. No one coughed. Even the musicians in the orchestra pit, who usually packed up their instruments, during solos stood still, their instruments in hand, staring at the stage. Then a sound broke the silence. It was a clap. Just one person at first, loud and sharp, from the back of the room. Then another joined in, and another. Within seconds, the silence shattered. The applause didn't start as a polite ripple. It exploded like a thunderclap. It started as a roar of pure disbelief, and then turned into a wave of admiration. People jumped to their feet. In the front row, the man who had shouted insults earlier was clapping so hard his hands were red. The woman with the expensive jewelry had tears streaming down her face, ruining her makeup, but she didn't care. She was clapping and shouting bravo. The young man in the back who held his phone was recording now. It's not to mock, but to capture a moment of magic he would never see again. The entire audience was on its feet. Out. The sound was deafening, bouncing off the high ceilings and shaking the velvet curtains. It was a wall of sound that washed over the stage. But Martha didn't react at first. She sat frozen, her head still bowed, her hands resting in her lap. She couldn't believe the noise was for her. She thought something must have gone wrong, or perhaps they were still laughing. But then Julian stepped forward. He walked over to her and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. He leaned down and spoke into her ear, loud enough for the microphone to catch it. "Martha," he said, his voice full of warmth, "stand up. They're standing for you." Martha looked up, her eyes wide and confused. She looked out into the darkness where the roar was coming from. As her eyes adjusted, she saw the sea of people. They weren't sitting in judgment anymore. They were standing in honor. They were smiling. They were clapping for her. A fresh wave of tears filled her eyes, blurring her vision. She wiped them with the back of her hand, leaving a smudge on her cheek, and slowly stood up. Julian didn't step back to take the spotlight. He took her hand, firmly in his, and raised it high in the air, like a referee declaring a winner. He was telling the world, "This is the champion." He bowed low toward her, a sign of respect from a master to an amateur. The crowd went wild. The cheering intensified. People threw flowers onto the stage. Single red roses and white lilies landed on the wooden floorboards near her worn-out shoes. Martha stood there, overwhelmed. She didn't know how to act. She gave a shy little wave like a schoolgirl, and then curtsied awkwardly. The crowd loved her even more for that. They loved that she wasn't polished. They loved that she was real. Julian guided her to the center of the stage, let her have the moment entirely to herself. He stood off to the side, clapping along with everyone else, a look of genuine happiness on his face. As the applause began to slow slightly, Julian walked back to the microphone. He raised his hand to quiet the room. It took a long time for the cheering to die down, and even when it did, people were still murmuring excitedly. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian said, his voice commanding but kind, "you've just heard a performance that money cannot buy. Technique can be taught, but soul cannot." He paused, looking out at the serious faces of the audience. Martha isn't a random guest. She is a hidden treasure. For the past 30 years, Martha has worked as a cleaner right here in this building. Many of you have walked past her. Many of you have ignored her. A murmur of shame went through the crowd. People looked at their shoes and looked at each other. They realized they had been walking past greatness without ever seeing it. "But," Julian continued, "I heard her playing on an old upright piano in the storage room late one night when I was leaving rehearsal. She plays to remember. She plays for her late husband. She plays to feed her soul. Tonight, she proved that music belongs to everyone, not just the elite. It belongs to the heart." Martha blushed deeply, but she was smiling now. It was a radiant smile that lit up her whole face. She looked younger than she had when she walked onto the stage. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet dignity. She picked up her old tote bag from the floor, clutching it like a trophy. The applause started up again, but this time it was softer, more respectful. The concert ended not with Julian's finale, but with this moment of connection. As Martha walked off the stage, guided by Julian, the crowd didn't rush to the exits. They stayed in their seats, talking in hushed, amazed voices. They talked about the music, yes, but mostly they talked about the lesson they had learned. On the way out, people were different. The rich patrons were kinder to the staff. The young people were looking around at the older people with new eyes. The story of Martha, the cleaner who played like an angel, spread through the city like wildfire. Later that night, as the staff was cleaning up the hall, Finding the dropped programs and the discarded flowers, the piano stood alone on the stage in the dim light. It looked just the same as it had before the concert. But to everyone who had been there, it was no longer just a wooden instrument. It was a vessel. The woman in the faded coat was no longer just a cleaner in the background. She was the artist who reminded them all to never judge a book by its cover, and to never underestimate the quiet person standing in the back of the room. The music had stopped, but the echo of that first note would resonate in their hearts for a long time to come.